So for those of you who don't know, I'm Jen MacLean. I'm the Executive Director of the IGDA and IGDA Foundation. This is my 26th year in game development. And fairly early on in that career, I had the opportunity to work with Scott Hartsman. We know you best, Scott, as the CEO of Trion, but I'd love it if you could just give a little bit of an overview of your game dev journey.
Sure. So, my name is Scott Hartsman. I'm currently the CEO at Trion Worlds. I've been in online games for as long as, almost as long as online games have existed. I worked with Jen way back in the day when we were just kids in one of the first generations of online games where she worked at AOL and I worked at the online offshoot of Interplay, if you'll remember that one from back in the day. It's called Engage Games Online, and that's also actually around the same time I met Gordon, who also worked with us back in the day. And we worked on very old school online games back then when the whole idea was get people to pay by the hour to just play for the privilege of playing co-op with distant friends. That was definitely a very different time. And then in later years, I'm more the biggest games I've worked on were the first EverQuest, the second EverQuest, and executive produced a game called Rift at Trion, and then was also involved with our publishing of ArcAge, and then most recently our game Trove. And throughout all of that, just so I can get a sense, raise your hand if you've worked on a live online game at scale, MMO. All right, so every single one of you is just as qualified to be up here giving this talk as me right now, because if those things are nothing else, they are basically crisis machines with wheels. And so the kind that we wanted to talk about today were more than just that, though. It was the kind that really go to the core of survival, the kind that go to the core of, is there going to be a game at all? Is there going to be a company at all? Oh, shit, what do we do?
So when you titled this talk, you titled it Crisis and Victory.
Yes.
And as you just said, there are different types of crisis.
Yeah.
Are you ever not in crisis? Is game dev ever not in crisis?
And that is definitely the part, a big part of it, is that we are always in that mode in some form or another, especially in online games, right? I've never had the privilege of shipping a game where you wrap it up, you burn a gold master, you hang out and relax and fix bugs, and then you ship, and then everybody takes time off, right? I've never done that, and I'm jealous of people who have. So in our, that's why I view a lot of our responsibilities as leaders, as producers, as CEOs, as team leads also, as to do everything we can to minimize crises, to try to bring some sense of normalcy to what we do. And the issue being, though, that these are live services. They are up and running 24/7. You don't ship and take a break. You ship, and then things get harder. Right. And so, yes, we are always I would say that we're always in some form of crisis, but it's our responsibility to try to minimize whenever possible.
So tell us about a time you were able to do that, because I think everybody here would love to know how you minimize that crisis.
Yeah. Honestly, I think a lot of, I'll go all the way back to the first EverQuest. So when I first joined that team, they had already had the game up and running. It hadn't hit its peak yet, but it was already a really big success. But the game itself was, they were incapable just because of the way they had built everything. It was a very sculpted experience as opposed to an architected experience, meaning every single piece of code in that game was specifically designed to make that game and nothing else, right? It was, we'll slap some more on here and slap some more on there. And they made a tremendous thing, but their ability to ship it on a regular basis was just a trash fire every single 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks. One of the things, and this is everybody in this room will laugh because this is, all standard that we all do right now. But just the basic act of figuring out how to QA an online service was not something that anybody had really been doing up until that point. And so, the way the interaction between the developers and the QA team was essentially developers would make stuff, would check it in on their desktop. A developer would build the full game client and server on their desktop and lob it off to a test server where players were playing. And then here was how the QA notes work. Hey, we updated the game. Go play it. that was how QA was told to go do their jobs. And then when bugs went live, developers got angry at QA. Why didn't you find the damn bugs? And but just the concept of putting some kind of process. I'm not a super huge process guy. I think that process strangles creativity if used wrong, and all of the bad things about process. But there has to be more than zero. Right. And so finding the lightest touch processes that you can to deal with the most common things that will, probably need to be done every single update or every single week or every single month. And honestly, I think that's like these days we would call that the bare minimum of acceptable responsibility. But back then it was like, holy shit, panacea of what they get actually, we tell them what we're changing in the game. They get to check the things we're changing before we give them to players. Yeah.
As someone who started their career in playtest, I want to hug you for that. So it was interesting to me. This is a little bit of a sarcastic question, but you talked about the process being essentially a dumpster fire every 4 or 8 weeks.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that?
Holy shit! Wow.
Well, I'm asking because there are, I'm sure,
Yeah.
people in the industry who want to know what's wrong with that. Like, why is that bad?
And that's the thing is there are actually good parts to it. That is a good point. I mean, because like I said, they had used very immature processes and very immature everything, and still had created a success. The issue though really comes into what happens when you want to scale up, right? And our company is headquartered in the Bay Area, so I'm constantly interacting with lots of Silicon Valley, very typical Silicon Valley companies. And one of the things that you hear all the time is people, trying to either not scale, they don't figure out how to scale correctly, or they try to scale too early. And in the problem of the original EverQuest, it was they hit scale and they didn't have any of the systems that you need in order to scale and succeed well. So why is that a problem? At the time I had joined in particular, there were, in the middle of an expansion development cycle, they hadn't updated the live game in 3 or 4 months, and they didn't have, those of you who are engineers will be aghast. There was no branching and source control. There was one main thing. It was the version. It was visual source safe. And the graphics engine was essentially the software equivalent of spread out in parts on a sheet on the garage, and hadn't been reassembled in 6 months. And so they lost their ability to ship the game. And when they had, so they got there, using no processes at all, but then they got to a point where they were trying to do some really cool stuff in software, but they couldn't ship. They lost their ability to ship. And so a lot of these processes were about, this was, essentially, mass crisis number 1 for me, which was, we can't ship our game. This is the thing that is making 100% of the money for our company. This is everybody's job. Holy crap, right? And so how do we get from that state to, some sense of normalcy?
When you look back at that, change is scary.
Yeah.
Even when you have to change. Mm-hmm. Did you find any kind of resistance to what you wanted to do to help make the company be able to ship the game?
That is a really good question. So yes, and I think it's also one of the reasons that when the committee had the speaker committee here had suggested the idea of doing a talk on crises, I actually thought it was a really fantastic segue into leadership just in general, as an overall theme, because who you are as a person, who you are as, a developer, who you are as how you think about humans and how you think about business, informs greatly how you go about handling things at times like that. And who I was back in those days is a very different person than who I was today. And so I think,
Wait, who you were?
Sorry, who I was. Yeah, thank you. All right.
Good heavens, Scott.
And so I was definitely, at that point, I felt like I had a lot more to prove. And so what you'll find, and I'm sure many of you have lived through this, if you're a person who feels like you have something to prove, if you're in charge, you tend to need to feel like you're the smartest person in the room, and you tend to need to talk over people or make sure that your opinion is the last one that's heard, and doing things more by demand and less by collaboration. And, so here we are 20 years later, and I was more of that person back then. So yes, we succeeded. And yes, I know, probably didn't make many friends in the process. But, at the end of the day, I think really we succeeded despite a lot of those attributes as to how I personally handled things, as opposed to succeeding because of them.
So it sounds like in that particular crisis, you were like, this is a huge problem. If you can't get in the bus, you need to get off and make room for people who are going to fix this huge problem.
Yep.
And I almost think of the wolf from Pulp Fiction, right? Like, this is a serious thing. If I am short with you, it is because we have something we have to fix right now.
Yes.
Now, pretty please with sugar on top, go get stuff done. What are you like now?
He is, in fact, one of my idols, no doubt. Yeah.
So tell me about a recent crisis and how you handled it and how that's different from what you did with the original EverQuest.
Sure. So, years later, or most recently, so 5 years ago, I rejoined Trion after being away for a year, and I came into the company as CEO, and it was an interesting time. For those of you who know from the company's history, it began making headlines, call it 10 or 11 years ago, when it had gone. The previous management had gone out and raised astronomical sums of money. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars, and all of us as a lot of us as developers think, well, a company that raises that kind of money, they're going to be set for life, right? I mean, that was how I always used to think of it. And then, so, picture this 5 years ago, coming back into the company, company, it was, I will say it was days from going out of business. It had 2 games live, a third game that was not really coming anywhere close to going live, and was essentially the definition of existential crisis. And so I had been at the company previously, and, again, my own leadership style, my management style had changed, pretty dramatically over the years. And honestly, it was the human beings at the company were why I wanted to come back, because in my first stint there, I was super impressed with the individual developers and all the teams and everybody. And I really just wanted to work with those teams again, even if it meant wading into what is probably the largest salvage operation I'd ever been a part of. So not only was the company running out of money, there was our first major partner was literally suing us. So there was a lawsuit there. We had a second major partner that was on its way to try to pull out of a publishing relationship with us, and so there were just more problems on either side than you could imagine. But a lot of what brought me back, like I said, was the people, and the reason I was able to build relationships with those people was that in my previous time there, I was honestly just very much more collaborative. I mean, at the end of the day, people need to know that the person who is in charge, and they are the final arbiter. But the trick, and I learned this over time, the trick of having arbitration power over something is to use it as little as possible. Right? You already have all the power. You already have you have it all. So the less you use it, the better off you are. The more you help other people grow into making the decisions themselves and helping guide them in the right direction, the better off everybody will be. And so it was much easier to come back in that second time and just immediately resume being, look, yes, I'm going to make some difficult calls, but you're going to understand why we're doing things, and you're going to have a chance to tell me I'm off my damn rocker and redirect me onto what the right thing is. And so I would say it was still just as urgent, but there are ways to be urgent without being vicious, without being angry, without being demanding.
That kind of restraint is not often talked about from leaders, particularly if you look at some of the tech leaders that tend to get a lot of press, for example.
Yeah.
How did you develop that? And was there someone in your career who inspired you and who kind of set that example for you to adopt?
That's an interesting one. So again, being in Silicon Valley, you hear it all the time, right? It's, the Steve Jobs story is, the one that goes everywhere. And I'll come right out and say, I think they succeeded despite him, not because of him, right? You can be that brilliant without being a dick, right? So what I had, I hadn't really had any great positive examples, to be honest. actually, I shouldn't say that. I've had positive examples of certain attributes of that. So one of my, he's simultaneously one of my favorite and one of my most contentious bosses ever. I worked for John Smedley for quite a few years, and stubborn as a mule, but very smart. But the thing that I loved about him in particular was he was always, always, always willing to have the argument. Right. Even if he felt crazy strongly about stuff, even if it was he was yelling at you, demanding something of you. If you came back at him with, this is why I think you're completely wrong, and A, B, C, D, E, and we could kind of have a heated discussion through it, and you could change his mind. And so a lot of other people around the company kind of feared him and just took the demand at face value and went, well, he demanded, and he demanded loudly, this is what I'm doing, right? But no, if you argued back, you weren't going to get fired. He actually kind of enjoyed it. And so what I learned from that was I have this habit through my career through my life, actually, of never feeling like I fit in anywhere. Just absolutely nowhere. And as a result, I have this incredible empathy toward misfits, because I strongly feel that I am one in every place that I am. And so on development teams, I kind of mentally segment people into you're a standard person or you're a misfit. You don't fit in, right? I love the misfits. I collect the misfits. I want the misfit. I want a great team, a balance of a team full of people who conform to existing structures and people who rail against them, right? People who understand and want to do things the right way, and people who say, F this, I need to invent my own way. Because one of the things that I found over the years is that the people who are the misfits are the ones that are most likely to also be those same people, the canary in the coal mine, who come to you and say, hey, boss, we're effed. We are completely and totally effed. And that is, again, segueing back to the crisis, the topic of crises, is that, in most companies, it's when the people who are doing the real work notice and report up that, hey, we actually have problems.
So that is, so first of all, this, I should note, is going to be probably a profanity-filled discussion.
Possibly.
But that's a really interesting segue, because you first talked about leadership being having authority but using it as little as possible. And then you just hit on empowering your team to tell you when something is fucked.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How do you create that environment where people feel safe? And I'm thinking back to Juan's talk that started us off on Monday, where he talked about initiative as a key leadership principle that the Marines use. How do you create that environment with your team where they are encouraged to show initiative, where they are encouraged to say, hey, we've got a big issue here you need to pay attention to? Yep. Because I'm curious, how many people in this room feel like they work in that environment right now? Maybe a third, maybe.
I'm very happy for that third of you. Yeah, and yeah, that is a great point, because it's like, how do you even discover that you're in that kind of environment? I can tell you that in my early days, like when arguing with bosses in the past, I just didn't know better than not to. Right. And I was just, through blind, stupid luck, never got myself fired for it. Right. But so what I've done is if we get a new our size of the company, we're about 200 people right now. So, I know everybody by name. I know everybody by face. There are still matches or mismatches in who they are, in which goes with which from time to time. But I try to make sure that as many people as possible understand who I am as a person. And if we get a new developer locally, I don't care if you're a director or an individual contributor entry level on your first day. I want to say hi. I want to make sure you understand that my door is open. I want to make sure that you understand that no subject is off limits, that uncomfortable conversations are frequently the most important ones people can have. And what I've gotten back from that, of quite a lot, is that nobody has ever said those words to them before. And that, nobody's ever just explicitly said, I want you to have uncomfortable conversations with me.
Did you ever have an uncomfortable conversation you wish you didn't?
Really not. I wouldn't say, not that I wished I didn't. I would say that there are ones that I like better than others. So the ones that I like the most are the ones where the person brings them to you and it's this huge thing in their mind and they tell it to you and you're like, oh, that's it? Okay, well, the fix for that, I can deal with that in 30 seconds for you, right? Those I love, right? The easy ones are great because you've made somebody's life tremendously better at almost no effort or cost. The harder ones tend to be more cultural and more social, right? It's, hey, we have a big morale problem on Team X, and it's because of the actions of Team Y, but both teams believe they're doing the right thing. Both teams, you know, they're both full of smart people, but there's just some cultural gnarliness that's going to take months to unravel and months to fix if there is a fix, right? Because sometimes at companies, just different groups have cross goals, right? Or goals that impact each other. Yeah.
So what you talked about in terms of kind of building that relationship with your team from the very beginning, that's a great example of something you can do when you're not in that existential crisis.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And one other thing, too, is that, you know, even beyond that initial conversation, I mean, the initial conversation is one data point. You know, human beings, we're data point collecting machines, right? It's, you know, we try to make observations in the world. We try to bring sense to it. And the more data that we get, the better decisions we're able to make, ideally. And so, but one other thing is that, you know, the advent of, you know, we use Microsoft Teams for it now. We used Skype for it previously. At other companies, we've used IRC. But I always try to make sure that me, as the person in charge of whatever, that I'm an active and social presence in those things, because you're not going to get to personally interact with 200 people all the time. But if you're participating in chats in the same place and in the same way that their coworkers are, they begin to trust you the same way, right? I mean, because like you and I know, just growing up, the act of making friends and inferring people's personalities from interaction in text online, I mean, shit, that's how I spent my 20s. I mean, I spent a decade making friends in text and all of that. And a lot of that really carries over. It's just moved on to different platforms. And, you know, I find that a lot of, you know, especially CEOs, you know, unless you're small companies, a lot of big company CEOs don't interact like that. You know, they feel like they need to keep themselves separated from the people doing the work. But, you know, no, if especially in time, and then in times of crisis, when everybody goes into, you know, we need to fight for our survival mode, and we're rolling up our sleeves. And, you know, the other analog that we use instead of, you know, beyond Winston Wolfe is Eugene in Apollo 13, you know, with the white vest and everything. It's, if you can show up and be a respected peer actually trying to solve problems with people, you know, they, you know, people respect that.
So I think that's all helpful if you are a CEO or even the leader of a team or studio. What advice do you have for the 2/3 of people who aren't on teams where they feel like they can raise those uncomfortable truths, especially if they aren't the ones leading the team?
That's, yeah, that, and so I think the best thing that people can do is, and, you know, this work, and again, please treat this as one data point, worked for me, may not work for everybody, is, you know, try to learn as much, take the opportunity that you have to at least broaden your own expertise so that someday you can find yourself in a place where you can, you know, where you can use those skills. So for instance, you know, I originally started out as a writer. I was the worst writer in the world. I mean, just terrible. And then, you know, became a systems designer, became, you know, got an engineering degree, became a programmer, then became a producer. And so the reason that I wanted to learn about all of those things, though, is I am happiest as a human being when I can see and understand how the whole system works together and how everything feeds into the next thing, such that, you know, we're creating this big holistic, you know, this big holistic thing. And so my advice to everybody is always to learn stuff outside your area, you know, and start by learning the stuff that is next to your area, right? Because if you can understand the transition between, you know, I as designer designed a system, then it goes over the fence to a programmer who implements the system, then it goes possibly to a different designer who fills the system with data, and then understand how it works through those, you know, through all of those processes, understand how it gets to QA, understand how the build gets, you know, how the build gets pushed alive, you know, become the feature Sherpa, right? It's like understand understand how everything works. Because the more you do that, the more value you'll have to more organizations. And then eventually you'll be able to pick and choose which organization you want to go to, which is my dream for, everyone in our development family, is that we should all be, AAA, best of our game, and able to pick where the F we want to go spend our time.
Yep. So in the notes that we exchanged for this talk, you had a really interesting little thing here that I want to talk about because it is directly contrary to so much conventional wisdom that we hear. Okay. I'm gonna read it out, and I would love for you to comment on it. In capital letters, bad.
Uh-oh.
Bring me solutions, not bring me problems. Bullshit on that. What the hell else are you there for?
Oh yeah. So there's a lot of conventional management advice that I'm just not a big fan of, and that's one of my huge pet peeves. I was a kid in the 80s. I grew up in watching 80s movies, and they all had, very typical business people giving very typical business advice, and there were business books and all of this, and I used to read all that crap. And yeah, bring me solutions, don't bring me problems. Fuck you. I hate that. I hate that so much. Again, it comes down to, how do you choose to use the power that you have, right? I want people to bring me problems because, again, it goes back to the case that I brought up earlier of, a human being comes to you with some that they feel is a life-blocking problem, and you explain to them that you can help them deal with that in 10 seconds. So it's like, bring me problems and let's collaborate on solutions. I am here to backstop you, right? I would prefer if you had the greatest solutions to all the problems in the world. Don't get me wrong. I would totally prefer that. But if you need me, I'm here for you, right? And no different than, and that needs to exist on every level of the organization, right? I go to the people who report to me, and I try to brainstorm with them on my problems. Because otherwise, why the hell are they here, right? I'm not going to try to solve gnarly multi-SKU production problems across 9 regions and 3 partnerships. I have smart people to help with that, and they should look at me the same way.
And it sounds like if I could put words in your mouth,
please.
You might say, hey, if you've got a problem and you know the solution, don't bring it to me. Just fucking do it.
Well, and that too. I'm also I'm a huge believer in ask forgiveness, not permission types of environments. I think that, companies that hit like an EA scale can afford to do the opposite. But anytime you are trying to do things with relatively modest sized teams, you can't, there is no overhead, you don't have the extra bandwidth, you don't have the overhead. Yeah.
So you got to talk about problems.
Yes.
What is the problem is like leadership structure, like organizational structure? How do you work with that in crisis with the structure of management with the people above you, but actually what's causing the crisis?
Oh, wow. So what to do if the people above you are the ones causing the crisis? How's your resume? Quite seriously, I think that, I have been in the situation like that in my own life where I have had to talk to people higher up than me, to say very bluntly, look, you're the problem, right? You are the reason that we are in this mess that we're in. And the best you can, and obviously, not in those words, but, hey, here, I have some suggestions for you for how to avoid problems like this in the future. Will you hear me out? Right. And then figuring out how to phrase that in a way that isn't very finger pointy and very, it's not important to feel right. It's important to get the other person to agree with you. Right. And so the feeling right way is you're the problem and I need you to admit it. Right. Okay. Well, that will work on 0 people, but you may feel better. Right. But the better way is, like I said, talk about the problem itself. Okay. Let's talk through how this problem got here. Right. And let's talk through what we can maybe change to make sure that this problem doesn't happen again. But even before that, I think the more existential question is one of, hey, do we even agree that this is a problem? Right. Because there are some companies where the people in charge want a certain type of behavior or want a certain type of environment. And to them, what you perceive as a problem, to them, it's a feature, right? So I would say establish that you agree that there's a problem. Then if so, try to work through it in a non-finger pointy way. Yeah.
Did you ever have someone on your team do that to you? And if so, tell us about that.
No, the people who've worked for me would literally come into my office and tell me to just go F myself. Yeah. I have. And I will say that it was done in it. So I'll be very blunt. So it's a game I used to executive produce. Obviously, there's separation anxiety, like Papa from his kid when it gets passed on to another executive producer. Of course, there is the temptation to offer helpful suggestions. I like to help, and the current people managing the team are less than thrilled with my help, and I have made some very poor decisions for them. I really have. And initially, they just rolled with it, and they just accepted them, and just kind of had us fall back into our old roles of they were the directors, I was the EP. We're going to do what the EP says. And it wasn't until it took probably 6 months of me making very small bad calls here and there, to where there was the heart-to-heart of. Okay, this thing you can look at where we were making money, and you can look at where we're making money now, and so this was a decision that we made at this time, and they didn't have to say that, oh, this was your dumbass decision that caused us to drop X amount of revenue, but I got the point, and that was by and large let them be them, and I still offer suggestions, but I don't I go through. That's one of the things that as you get promoted through your career, you realize that your words carry more weight, even though you feel like the same exact person your entire time, and everything feels the same to you. But suddenly, offhanded comments that you make, people can take as just mandates. And so I find that for every level up, every level up of a new job, I find I have to ratchet down the intensity of language until eventually it's going to be like one-word monosyllabic questioning sounds. But it's really it's hey, what do you think about, right? It's would it be hey, I've got a stupid idea, what do you think, right? I do the I know that there's a big there's a big debate going on right now, softening language and the way different genders express themselves and so on. But I find myself using softening language like crazy just to make sure that people don't go sprinting off in directions that are going to be harmful.
Or think that they're about to be fired.
Or that, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to quote something else you wrote.
Okay.
Get used to being blamed for a ton of things you had no direct control over. You're leading, it's all your fault.
Yep.
The buck stops with you. Sometimes it's a bad decision you made. Sometimes it's failing to set context right for others. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's just failing to be psychic. Own it and figure out the best way to move forward. Yeah, I am a huge believer in that, I don't care what it is. I don't care if I had any control. It's my fault. I'm a big establishing blame and establishing fault and all of that to me is only useful to the extent that you use it to identify the thing that needs fixing. And so by default, it has to be my fault, right? I mean, just either, I didn't know, I didn't, the point about setting context for somebody, I wasn't clear about what an expectation was, right? And that there's one thing that I think all of us could get better at is communication. Nobody is 100% perfect at it until the day where we can just think thoughts at each other directly, there's going to constantly be problems, right? And so that was one of the other big adjustments for me, again, over my career. I would say the most idyllic time for me was when I was a gameplay programmer and I was just getting to write cool gameplay systems on EverQuest 1. Because it's a compiler, it's an objective right or wrong, you can see if it worked, and you move the F on, right? These days, job's very different. Why not go back and be a gameplay programmer?
If and when I get fired because of this talk, maybe I will. At some point, I actually I still do program, but it's very spare time stuff. But everything being your fault later on is you realize that there are many things, there are more than not that you are responsible for, but you have zero direct impact on. Right. And that just becomes an attribute of life. And it just becomes something you have to find a way to get good with. It's literally the opposite of the deterministic job of code, compiler, go, ship. Right. And so I think all of us will have to, everybody has to come up with their own coping mechanisms for that. Some people rail against it and become micromanagers.
Yeah.
And that to me is like the dark pathway of trying to react to that. The lighter pathway is to help other people learn, help other people grow into seeing the things and catching the things that you may have missed, or helping them to understand how how the decision they should have made versus the one they did, how does that not align with who we are as a company or who we are as people or what our core values are, right? And so that's what I mean by not setting context.
So you talked a little bit about coping mechanisms, and when you lead through accepting responsibility, and when you lead through developing other people as opposed to micromanaging them, that takes a toll.
Yeah.
So especially as, in the context of leading from crisis to victory, tell me a little bit about the physical and mental and emotional toll that takes and how you handle it.
So I think it takes a special kind of broken person to spot a trash fire and then sprint at it and go, oh, yeah, I got to go do that. But, I am one of them. And again, but at the same time, I think it takes a special kind of person to work in online games in general, because, the things that drive us, I mean, sure, they have a lot of game things in common, but they tend to be at least slightly different, right? And so I think, one thing that I never used to be good at, but I'm much, much better at now is learning to pick and choose your battles. You are not going to win everything all the time. You are going to have people around you making mistakes that you could have dove in and prevented. Understanding which ones of those are worth you doing that and worth putting stress on that relationship, and understanding which ones aren't is critical to me.
So what's the secret?
What's that?
Tell us, what's the secret? How do you understand?
It's just honest to God, it's just take a breath. I mean, it's instead of leaping into every emergency has the same priority. It's it's going through the mental triage of, okay, well, what's the worst thing that happens if this person ships this thing this way? Is it a minor thing that is super reversible? Then you know what? We're going to let it happen, and it's going to be, it's not going to cause us a big black eye, and we'll be able to reverse it, and it'll be fine, right? And they'll hopefully learn something in the process, or you can then have a talk to make sure that they learn something in the process. But, getting in and, parachuting in at the last minute, you see a plate about to hit the floor, and if you're always the person who feels like you need to slide under and catch every plate, that is absolutely not sustainable, right? I've been, I think it was either EverQuest 1 or 2, I forget which one, but I was actually so stressed out during those days, developed a facial tic, was sleep, waking up at 2:30 or 3 in the morning every day, 2 hours of sleep. But the most important thing to me is to take a breath and make sure that, it's not, understand which battles to fight and which ones you should let slide.
So what got you out of that destructive pattern in EverQuest? And how did you get from there to kind of wisdom and maturity and leadership that you show now?
Yeah, it was the something's got to change moment, right? It was in going through it was the EQ2 launch in particular was crazy. I mean, we were. So I've done it a 180 on crunch, by the way. Also, is that we had signs on the wall that showed you what our crunch status was, and how many of you have worked in a asses in seats crunch environment at any point in your life? Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. I have so much sympathy for all of you. Yeah, I mean, we had the sign on the wall, and based on the number that was on the wall, that was how many days a week and how many hours of each of those days you were going to be in. And it was just devastating, right? And it was after that experience I went, life is too short. I mean, the one thing I can tell you the exact thought it was too. I was in my mid-30s, and I realized that money is a renewable resource. The sole non-renewable resource we all have is time. That is it. And how you choose to spend your time is entirely up to you. And you need to take as much control of that as possible. And honestly, that was the big thing that made me go, there's got to be a different way.
See, we've talked a little bit about leading individuals particularly and a little bit on leading teams. Let's talk about team culture. Okay. And how do you handle it when it's the culture that's the crisis?
When it's the culture that's the crisis. You couldn't be referring to anything in the news lately. So honestly, and again, we've seen stories like this. Again, outside of games, we get them up in Silicon Valley all the time, right? I mean, Uber is the big classic, right? When the culture is the crisis, there need to be some very painful decisions made. I mean, people don't change on their own. Pain, I hate, and this is going to sound horrible, but pain causes change, right? Pain and loss causes change. Nobody changes just because they feel like they need to change or somebody tells them they need to change. That the sticking value on that is less than zero, right? And so when the culture is the problem, you have to identify the people who embody, inside of an organization, somebody needs to come in and identify the people who embody the culture that should exist. And then quite bluntly, those people need to be in charge, right? And the people who were the problem need to either subtract themselves. I mean, they just need to not be there, right? And that tends to be the only thing that works. We have one hand in the back.
So you talk about choosing your battles,
Yes.
catching all the plates, and when pain causes change. Do you believe in seeing an issue, letting the plate drop so that the person learns from that plate dropping?
Yeah, like I said, if it's Jeff Bezos at Amazon has a philosophy that I love quite a lot about this particular thing, is that decisions that you make them the more reversible they are, the faster you should make them. The less reversible, the longer you should take to consider them. I kind of think the same thing about letting plates hit the floor. It's how reversible. What is the impact of this? What is the impact of this be if the bad decision gets made, and how reversible is it? Right? So the reversibility and the amount of the black eye you're going to get, if it's low on both of those, just let it happen, right? Just let the person screw it up and it'll be fine. Unless you know for a fact they'd appreciate you getting involved and blah 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 blah. But with the big existential earth-shattering stuff, that you can't let go, right?
When you think about culture,
Yeah.
what is the team you've worked on that has the best culture, and what makes it special and different?
I would say the one I'm on right now. No, I think man, not to waffle, but I mean, what's the definition of best, right? Because I think that even, because I think there are different definitions of best based on different points in people's lives. Because even though, like, when we were, again, I'll go back to EverQuest 1, we were all fairly young, right? We were all a very tight team. We felt like we were at war together every day. That creates a certain bonding. It creates a certain closeness. We were always at each other's houses. We were always out drinking together. We were always having fun. That was great culture at the time. Professionally, it was destructive as shit. But I mean, personally, it was amazing culture. And so I enjoyed it. Probably it's one of my favorite jobs ever. Which do I think is more, a little bit more, I think our current culture, which is, we're all a little bit older. A lot of people have kids. A lot of people have families. A lot of people, get to, want to think about things like work-life balance, which is a skill I have never mastered myself. But it's important to think about those things and plan around those things. Like I can tell you on our, in our studio right now, we have done mandatory crunch exactly 0 times, right? Even getting Rift out the door. We never did, we never did ass in seat, you're on 6x12s and, all of that. We never did that once. And I'm really happy about that. I don't think anywhere I've been is perfect, right? Everything is always a work in progress all the time. And actually, it took me a long time to get okay with that, because when I was a kid, I grew up with this real crusader personality where I wanted the world to make sense and be just and all of this all the time. And if it wasn't, I took it super personally. And, it took me a long time to just realize that the goal is to be making progress and make things better and better, not to attain perfection, because you're never going to attain perfection. And if perfection is a requirement of happiness, you're never going to be happy.
So a lot of the points you've made come back, they have an undercurrent of empathy. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you talk about making the tough decisions and being the person who is fundamentally accountable. Yeah. Is there tension between empathy and accountability, and how do you handle that?
Constantly. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah. I think a lot of the decisions, a lot of the times you're making a hard call, especially during, getting back onto the crisis topic, you find yourself in a state when you're making decisions between what's the least worst option, right? It's what is the least horrible thing I can do right now from this huge, lovely buffet of shit in front of me. And so, but the goal in doing all of that is to you're making a bunch of least worst choices to try to climb one step up at a time to eventually you're able to start making what's a good choice again, right? Which is more of when you're in a survival, in a survival type of mode. But through all of that, I mean, I think the thing that defines what is least worst versus which is not, is all driven by empathy. And to me, like my North Star in my life as I'm making those decisions is what is the decision that I will make that will have the most positive impact for the largest number of human beings. And I'm very transparent about that with anybody that I work with. And they've come to understand that is who I am. And that is how I'm, even if I have to so when they see me make a decision that looks like, holy crap, what did he just do? They still understand how I think, and they understand intuitively that, wow, the alternatives must have been even worse. And, and that's usually it. Like the biggest one to put a bit of concrete story on that, when I took Trion over like 5 years ago, the company was 650 people, 4 buildings on 2 continents, burning money like crazy. First thing I had to do was fire 350 people, right? And that was horrible. That is you would look at that and go, holy shit, what a terrible thing to do. He's one of those cruel CEOs that just runs around firing people. No, the alternative was 650 people lose their jobs. So when you look at it through that lens, you realize, oh, okay, so maybe this was actually, kind of a smart move. And I think that everybody who's gone through, I know every CEO that I've ever worked with, every manager, every studio head, everybody hates doing it. And the thing that is frequently unspoken is that, oh no, the alternative to doing the shitty thing I just did, yeah, that's even worse, right?
I have one last question for you.
Yeah.
It's a big one, and then we'll encourage some questions for the audience. What advice would you give to your fellow game developers that are facing their own crises and their own turnarounds?
I think, so a couple things, and it depends on where you are. It depends on where you are in the organization, but I would encourage anybody, even if you're a line developer on your first day versus executive producer or something, is over time, you will develop a sense of, and I will use your favorite phrase. Understand the difference of are you in a small crisis, or are you at the we are well and truly fucked, oh my God, everything is horrible phase, and understand the difference between the two, and understand that. If you feel that you are in the latter, you have a duty to your team, you have a duty to your coworkers to try to make as many other people aware of that as possible, right? Don't do it lightly, but definitely do it, because what I find is that a lot of the time, at every development studio, there are elephants in the room. I hate elephants in the room. Elephants in the room are the most destructive thing. It's the topic that everybody knows is going horribly, but nobody is willing to talk about, right? And having a culture that celebrates people bringing stuff up like that versus punishing it, to me is really important. And so, figure out which of your coworkers agree with you, right? Because, like I said, most of the time when you are legitimately screwed like that, it's when it bubbles up from the people who are closest to the work that it actually can get to the level where it gets fixed. And so I would say don't be afraid to put your neck out, especially in games. I've worked inside games. I spent a few years working outside of games. If there's one thing that I've seen at the vast majority of game studios is that yes, some run like families, some run like teams, some run like businesses, but we're all at least, we're all at least gamers together. And so there is at least that bit of closeness and camaraderie where you are probably much more likely to be extended extra leeway than you think you are. And so take that chance. And like I said, don't treat that as life advice. Treat it as one data point. If you get fired for doing that, I'm so sorry. Gordon.
So big part of leadership, word actually means imagining, deciding and selling a future. Can you talk about how you did that at Trion to, go from where you started to where you are today and where you're going next?
So how to, on selling, selling a future, communicating a future. I'm a big fan of the wide open, no holds barred team meetings. When I first came back to the company, when we were in hardcore, what the hell's going on mode, it was the all hands every week. Every week, as many questions as people wanted to ask, with me giving status updates, and me being very transparent. Very transparent with our current status. And where everything was going from there. One thing that I have found is that. Lots of companies keep a lot of stupid stuff secret that really doesn't need to be secret at all, right? Hey, guess what? My biggest game has generally about 1 million MAUs. It spikes up to 3 million when we do a major update, and you will never see that printed anywhere. You'll never see that printed anywhere in a private company because everybody keeps that to themselves, right? And so I overshare. Right, I would rather overshare and risk stuff getting out, because the penalty, again, you go into what's the penalty for stuff getting out? Probably nothing, right? But what's the penalty for not having people around you aware of what the hell is going on with their lives and their jobs? The penalty for that is way worse, right? And so I would rather make sure that people are informed of exactly where we are, and I'd rather overshare. And if it gets out, so be it. I have found repeatedly over my career, despite some individual disappointments, of course, where if you treat your coworkers like the adults they are, and you trust them like you would trust yourself, you will find that vastly more often than not, they will not let you down. And what I think a lot of people do, though, is they get let down once or twice, and they suddenly change the way they think about treating other people and how much they're willing to share. I would say don't let that hold you back. Yeah. I'll let you call people.
Yeah. The gentleman in the back with glasses, I think it's Alejandro.
Yes. So, as a leader coming into a new organization that's, to an organization that's already established like Trion, how do you make sure, or do you have a philosophy on making sure that the existing leadership underneath you hires or mentors people that fit what your vision of handling a crisis is, and how you make that transition from an organization that has a different philosophy?
Yeah. Yeah. And so that did happen a lot during the first time I came to the company, when it was a different kind of crisis. They were, very behind on their first game. They had a bunch of tech being built by very smart people, but it wasn't headed in the same direction as the rest of the company. And quite, I think in cases where, you have leads or directors that may or may not be on board with where you're heading, it's important to have very blunt conversations about, look, are you on board with this, or are you not? And if you're not, we need to figure out an exit path, right? Because people need to be bought in, and they need to be genuinely happy about being there and genuinely on mission with you. And if you're not, then that's fine. Then let's get them to another company where they might be, and let's get somebody in who is. I definitely don't recommend just running around with with finger guns shooting people and firing them on the spot. That's not a great way to do anything. But understanding that people need to fit in an organization, there's really only two answers: they do or they don't.
I think we had a question, then colorful shirt. Shamar?
Okay, so I apologize for my French accent first. I have a question for you, Scott. It's a little bit complicated, but I'll try to make it simple. Being successful is about doing things in the right order, making the right prioritization, but also doing them sequentially in the right order. And when you have a vision as a leader, usually you convince people around you that this is the right path, and you seek validation for that, and that comforts you that you're going in the right direction. And then there's the temptation to do shortcuts, to go faster, or to eliminate steps, because you have to prioritize more, because you are in a crisis, or because you have pressure from your board. How do you deal with that? Any advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Can you please repeat the question?
So I had to do, with conflicting pressures from, and correct me, I'll try to paraphrase, conflicting pressures from, crisis from the point of view of your team to point of view of your board, and how do you deal with, the conflict therein? Is that about it? Yeah. Okay. That is, I always over communicate on both sides, and I find that when there are conflicting when there are conflicts like that, over communicating on both sides is the only answer, because like we have had that exact issue where what's good for the team is not good for the investors, what's good for the investors is not good for the teams, and your goal is to try to convince them, at least don't tell anybody, but my goal in that is always to use as much time as possible to try to convince the investors of what's best for the teams. Because at the end of the day, whether we succeed or fail will be based on the efforts of the teams. Therefore, advocating, I view myself as their advocate. And so, and over communicating on the subject and using some of those same tactics that I had talked about earlier with trying to steer people, you're creating the problem, we need to steer you onto this path where that problem isn't happening. And if there's one thing that I haven't been actually enough in my life is forceful enough sometimes with boards and investors, and renegotiating contracts and, and that kind of thing. And so I wish I would, I think I would always advocate being more forceful on that side than you think you can be.
So then mine kind of comes back to crisis to victory. I'd like to know, taking 650 down to 350.
Yeah.
Not the easy step, but it might have been the most obvious when you just go focus, cut our overheads. My question is really about, it's 5 years later, it's obviously been successful. Do you have a standard path or process you like to go into crisis with, where, yeah, I'm interviewing people and yeah, I'm finding what the elephants in the room are, but what are the process steps you did to make the other key decisions you had to make that a success? Because in my mind,
Yeah.
the reduction in force
Yeah.
is the easy step.
Yeah. And
Step to admit, but
Yeah.
the easy one. What were the other critical path things you did to understand the crisis?
yeah. So that's really, so I did some of it well, and I completely screwed up other parts of it. And so one of the things that I did very well was everything comes down to cash. Everything, in a company in crisis, everything comes down to cash. And so, a lot of CEOs and a lot of people will look at, what do the financial statements say? What does the balance sheet say? What does the cash flow statement say? Bullshit. Give me your register of the last 6 months of every transaction in and every transaction out. I want to look at it. Right. And so I did the basics of a forensic analysis myself of where the fuck is all this money going? Right. And then just trying to figure out, what can go and what can stay. And you find some horrible, horrible stuff that way, especially when you're talking about companies that have raised a ton of money and people are acting like they're working at a $10 billion organization with the company Amex. Right. And so that I did really well. One of the things that I did not do so well was when I looked and I was like, wow, this company sure pays a lot of lawyers. I should really look into that. And then I took the job. And then I went, oh, we're getting sued left, right, and center. No wonder this company pays a lot of lawyers. And so I should have probably asked a little bit more about exactly why we were paying all those kind of lawyers. But everything else was going on, and I just let that one slide. But I would say, always... The general solution, though, to your question is find the lowest level information you possibly can. Don't settle for a summary in any topic. Find the lowest level information you can and assemble your own picture from there. And then when I was able to do that, and across the parts of the company where I was able to apply that kind of logic, we did pretty well. Across the parts of the company that I wasn't able to, or didn't think to apply that logic, are places that we struggled.
Especially with things that tend to get out to the public
Yeah.
that you didn't intend. Has there ever been a game development crisis in that regard where the community itself helped you get through it?
I would say, yes, for sure. I used to spend a ton more time in our communities myself than I get to these days. And yes, I would find that as a general strategy. I will say, though, it was much more common 10 years ago than it is today, when the tenor of the internet has taken the turn that it has. But there were definitely times that we would do that, particularly on the second EverQuest and in the early days of Rift, where as developers, we found ourselves interacting. My general strategy is, if I can find a place that I can inject a useful thing that will make a person grateful interjected, I will get involved in a community discussion. And I limited my interactions very specifically to that type of interaction, because what that then did was that caused other people community leads to model that behavior until eventually, there was this virtuous cycle of players helping players. And people would kind of, their default behavior to us was to back us up, not to attack us over things. That was a nice time. I miss that time. Yeah, that was, and you tend to not get as much benefit of the doubt anymore now that tends to be a single hive mind on most topics, and, we all know what happens in that. So I have seen it happen before, haven't seen it happen recently.
I have a two-part question.
Please.
So a big part of managing crisis is the whole airplane model, put the oxygen mask on yourself before you address it for other people. So doing that for yourself requires a lot of self-knowledge. So the first question is, are there resources, philosophies, books, people that you follow, anything like that for growing that within yourself to self-calm in that moment? And then once you clearly have a handle on that now, but how do you help somebody else then self-calm when they're running around with their hair on fire?
That's a really good one. So I'll be very blunt. I am only slightly good. Of those two, the weaker point is helping other people calm down and evolve. What I have found, though, is that, again, many conversations over many weeks, months, and years is what it takes. It is not a thing where, have you ever walked up to a super panicked person and said, hey, just calm down? Yeah, that goes well, right? Yeah, that's a winner. But so, I have worked with people like that have matured over time, and they were very panicky to start. But again, it's long-term relationship building, right? And it's acting the ways you want. It's acting in modelable ways. I want to, and having that person observe the way you react, right? Eventually, they will begin to adopt those behaviors. But yeah, it's not easy.
I think Josh had a question, then Gordon, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
So you are who you are, and you're playing to your strengths. You very clearly have an expressive social style. Not everyone has that. Can you imagine someone else in your position, or have you worked with someone in your position, handling the same kind of crisis you handle that use a different style? Because I don't think you're necessarily advocating that your style is the only one that would work in any kind of crisis.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. As a matter of fact, I have worked with somebody who was basically the diametric opposite of me in terms of personality, and was in a role that was, very similar to the firefighter. He was much more dispassionate, detached, very logical, almost perceived as cold, but extremely effective in a crisis, right? And because he was a respected leader in his team, they respected him, and they all got along really well. So yeah, I mean, I view my own personality as it's one data point, right? I used this tactic because it works for me, but I think though that there are certain underlying attributes no matter what the exterior personality has, and this is I'm going to sound old as shit when I say this, but Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, despite the fact that it's this book that was written in 1970 or whatever, and it's been rewritten 40 times since then, there are some core principles in there that are just timeless, and they apply to people of any personality, right? It's essentially they boil down to, hey, don't be a dick. Right. Show interest in other people, show empathy to other people, and you can do that with any personality type.
So I love your approach to trying to consensus build around crisis decisions.
Yeah.
Can you talk to times when there's no time to build consensus?
Oh yeah. If there, and that's the thing is that if there is no time to build consensus around things, and you just need to be barking orders to get stuff done, that is when you're making a conscious decision that you are actively possibly going to be burning goodwill with the people who you are giving orders to. But the thing is, if you've built up enough goodwill and they understand that you are only doing this because there is no choice, right, then they will understand. And these days, like if I had to do something, with my leads today, I would just say, folks, there is no choice. This is exactly what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. And there is unfortunately no room for argument. Yes, there would be people that are pissed, but the pissed would last about 5 minutes. And they would go, well, he says there is no choice. Maybe I'll bug him later and find out if there really is or not, but he's probably serious. But yeah, it's all about building up that goodwill, because, you never want to burn it. You never like burning it, but sometimes you have to.
Scott, I think this conversation could have gone on another hour. Thank you so much for being so open and generous with your wisdom for the room and for sharing both the good and the bad of leading from crisis to victory.
And thank you, Jen, for helping out with this. By the way, I hope everybody appreciated the format, and thank you for including the questions. Thank you guys very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, thank y'all very much. I'm in Texas. My bad.